people are doing. So, well, see this video comparison, it's gonna be interesting at the very least, because if you didn't know already, the X100 Pro is actually one of the best videography cameras I've ever used. And that says a lot, because I have used the iPhone and I've compared the X100 against the iPhone, and it shone through. Now, it wasn't quite as good as the iPhone, in my opinion at least, but it got super close, unnaturally close. It's not supposed to be this close, especially a Vivo flagship, which is historically, it's always been a photography device. This time it's both. I found that to be fantastic. But then we have the OnePlus 12, which I would say, simply put, it's not quite perfect. It has its flaws, and it lacks a lot of the versatility options that you might get on the X100 Pro. But now in video, at the very least, it has 4K on the selfie camera. Now the X100 is supposed to get something like that soon enough, but yeah, it's not here yet, so you can't really ask me to test it out. I can't. I don't have the update yet. I don't know why, but that's just the way it is. Maybe global versions will receive it later. Maybe I will receive it later. Who knows? But at this specific point in time, I can tell you this much: the resolution is obviously at an advantage with our OnePlus 12 over here. Now, when it comes to portrait video, with the front cameras at least, look, I have my problems with portrait video. I don't think that they can be all that accurate a lot of the times. But we do have a lot of options when it comes to the X100 Pro, and both of them are limited to 1080p. And well, I do like a lot I'm using the natural portrait option on the X100 Pro, which I feel like gives really nice looking skin tones and slightly better contrast, in my opinion. And if you don't like it, you can just switch it off. But to be entirely honest, I don't really think anyone should be using portrait video until it gets ludicrously close to perfection, which it's really not here. Alright, so I think it's more than obvious that indeed the OnePlus 12 gets 4K 30. I hope that they don't remove it in the OnePlus 13 or whatever comes after this. But anyways, yes, there is definitely slightly higher detail and slightly higher sharpness on the OnePlus 12's selfie video. That's definitely visible, at least on a large screen without huge compression and all that jazz. But the X100, I gotta give it props. Even with 1080p, it can somehow, I don't know if it manages to contrast exceptionally well, if the optimization is so on point, but it somehow produces a ridiculous amount of detail, and it looks really good, especially for 1080p video. And you can kinda understand, right? If we can get 4K or 4K 60 on the front cameras, how good it can look. Now for selfie portrait video, I think that the OnePlus 12 just did not look as nice, especially with the colors, and the detail level took a pretty significant hit. The X100, because it can produce a lot of detail anyways with 1080p, the detail levels are actually a good bit higher on the X100 with selfie portrait video specifically. Also, edge detection was significantly better, more accurate on the X100 Pro. It's actually a very impressive job that Vivo has done with the X100's edge detection in general. Like, you can actually get very close to perfection with it, which is a good sign. Now then, for 4K 30, I can tell you this much: there's definitely a lot of similarities, but also some key differences that need to be kept in mind. So I think the OnePlus 12 in general has slightly lower sharpness. Now I can see this difference, you might not be able to, which is why we have a details comparison coming soon enough, so don't go anywhere. But anyways, I also think that the general exposure on the OnePlus is more often than not higher as opposed to the X100, which can sometimes lead to overblown highlights and also slightly overexposed shadows in certain cases. Sometimes you might get more shadow detail because it is coming with a higher exposure, but overall I prefer the X100. The way it looks, the white balance, everything just looks more accurate and looks more pleasing and more professional on the X100. They may all appear to be minor differences, but they do count. Now another thing that I find to be, in my opinion, better on the X100 is that the OnePlus 12 tends to shift the exposure quite drastically a lot, especially when you have a backlit situation or something like that. It definitely does it a lot, and it can be distracting. It looks less professional as opposed to the X100, which doesn't do it quite as much, or at least does it in a way that it's not distracting. Now when it comes to the ultra-wide camera, now I think the differences are far less between the two, because the white balance is basically perfect on both, and the general detail preservation, all that stuff, it's very similar. Also, I do want to mention about stabilization. It's basically the same on both, but both of them do let in some jitters and stutters. jerks, stuff like that. It's minor, but you can kind of see it as we walk around. Even with the ultrawide camera, they are definitely visible. And you can also see how the exposure in general is just way higher on the OnePlus 12 as opposed to the X100, which I prefer the X100, simply put. Now then with zoom, see, I have a pretty significant problem with the OnePlus 12. It has a 3x zoom, that's nice and all, but the problem is that when you're trying to zoom in while you're recording, you have to use a slider, or you can use the plus or minus sign buttons for a kind of a stuttering zoom, which doesn't really look good, and the slider can be problematic to use because it's not very user friendly, not in my opinion. I'd much rather have just simple toggles for 0.6, 1x, 2x, 3x, that kind of thing. And look, to be completely fair, the 3x on the OnePlus 12, it looks good and it looks very nice and detailed. The sensor quality speaks for itself and you can walk around with it. The stabilization is not too bad. You can't really, do whatever you want, but there's definitely options here. Now when it comes to the X100 Pro, see, I much rather prefer the toggle zoom. You can just jump from one focal length to another and it works really well on the X100. I think it's fairly seamless. It's not perfect, but it is what it is. Now there is a 2x zoom option on the X100 which I would just recommend never to use, because even though the 2x sensor crop on the X100 with photos, it works exceptionally well, that's just not the case with the video department. It just obviously doesn't work as well as with photos. So just don't use that, ignore it, and you can jump straight over to 4.3x, which does give you more zoom, but it also takes a much larger hit with stabilization as opposed to the OnePlus. Now then, when it comes to focusing, with 4K 30 at least, I can tell you this much. It's basically exceptional on the OnePlus 12. You're gonna have no problems whatsoever with the OnePlus 12's focusing. It works really well, even when switching from close-up subjects to medium range and then straight to the background and then back again. There's just no issues whatsoever. And as you would naturally expect, the same goes for the X100 Pro. To be entirely honest, focusing at this point, it should never be a problem with flagships. And I get it, the OnePlus 12 isn't exactly a flagship, but it kind of qualifies as a flagship killer, and so you would expect some of the basic things like focusing to work really well, and fortunately for us, it works really well on both. Now then, when it comes to 4K 60, I kinda liked the contrast that the OnePlus 12 started with, but as you can tell, the exposure isn't quite as well balanced as the X100 Pro, which maintains enough exposure to give us good shadow detail, whilst also ensuring that it's not too bright. The OnePlus can be seen underexposing in a lot of cases, and in general, the exposure balance and the contrast balance is not quite as good as the X100 Pro in my experience. Something similar can be said with the ultrawide camera with 4K 60 once again, and this time I think the X100 Pro has much better contrast, and you can see that on the OnePlus because of the much higher exposure, a lot of the colors look a little faded, and sometimes the exposure does drop, but of course that adds to the inaccuracy if anything at all, on the OnePlus that is. And then of course we have Super Stable. Now neither of these have the higher quality Quad HD variants of Super Stable available, which is unfortunate, but that's just the way it is. But to be entirely honest, with the 1X Super Stable at least, the X100's detail preservation is miles ahead of the OnePlus 12. I don't know what it is about the 1080p video that we get out of the X100 Pro, but it works exceptionally well. There's just no doubt about that. Now, I had expected that the ultra-wide option that we get on the OnePlus 12 with Super Stable would be ludicrously better as opposed to the X100, but that's just not the case, because I see way more stuttering as opposed to even the 1X that we got from the OnePlus 12 itself. So why even bother using the ultra-wide camera? It only leads to a loss in quality and actually worse stabilization somehow, because the X100 has more stabilization, and because it's using 1X, it looks significantly better as well. Now then 8K, see, the X100 Pro, it has exceptional 8K, some of the best that I've ever seen, because you not only get a lot of detail and very high quality video, you also get very beautifully stabilized video. Now in this particular case, I think the OnePlus actually has slightly better contrast, and it's not as overexposed as the X100. Well, it's not overexposed per se, but it's a little too bright, like the OnePlus was in previous situations, something like that. But what bothers me on the OnePlus is pretty simple. It doesn't have the level of stabilization, and because of that, I can't really recommend that you can use 8K instead of 4K 30 on a regular basis like we can on the X100 Pro. It's completely viable. Not the case on the OnePlus, of course. Now something that the OnePlus actually provides, which the X100 somehow doesn't, is Dolby Vision or just HDR video recording. Now, the Dolby Vision on the OnePlus, I checked it out on the OnePlus itself in pure Dolby Vision, which was just, it looks so good. I cannot begin to explain just how much watered down the general contrast looks on the OnePlus 12, because the maximum brightness of the highlights like the sun versus the lowest level of brightness, which would be the blacks on the OnePlus 12, it's so massive with Dolby Vision that you can't even see it with the SDR, as unfortunate as that is, but that's just the way it works. And it's just odd that a phone as versatile as the X100 doesn't provide us with the options for any kind of HDR whatsoever. I get it, it's kind of a niche feature and you need a compatible display for it, but still, I want the feature. Now then, when it comes to 4K details, see, we're gonna crop into 500%, and as you can tell, the X100 Pro does have a lot of sharpening going on. Now, to be fair, that is adding a whole layer of detail on the X100's video, and this is in indoors lighting. It's good lighting, but still indoors, so in general you would get even better details when you're shooting outdoors. But I think the ideal looking video would be something kind of in between the two. I guess leaning more towards the X100 Pro with like 70% of the sharpening that it adds to the videos. I think that would make it look perfect, just sharp enough to give us all the details we could have asked for, and also not too much to give us artifact or anything like that. Now then, with the ultrawide camera, once again, these are not ideal conditions. I'm trying not to go too ideal with the conditions because then that wouldn't really translate to real world usage. But in this case, when we crop into 500% once again, it looks good on both, it looks very similar on both, but both of them seem to suffer from the same issue that I can see. Both of them have a lot of noise, and there's a lot of noise reduction artifacts going on. Now, back when I compared the X100 to the iPhone's ultrawide specifically had way less of this artifacting going on, just for reference. But in this case, as you can tell, both of them have the same issue. I guess the X100 has slightly better contrast and slightly, maybe, just a pinch more detail in some areas. Now then, for 8K, see, I already mentioned the problem with the OnePlus stabilization, but another thing that I really want to point out is just check out the white balance. It is so perfect on the X100 Pro. This entire scene was lit with warm lights, like really warm lights, and just look at how perfectly balanced the X100 looks. The OnePlus is overcompensating by a lot. It also doesn't have nearly as much contrast as the X100, which makes it look even better on the X100 in my opinion. Now, when it comes to details, I think it's more than clear that the X100 Pro is miles ahead of the OnePlus 12. It's kind of unfortunate that the 8K isn't as good because the 4K is fairly comparable both with the main and ultrawide camera. The 8K, it's just not. This X100 pulls ahead by quite a bit. Now then, low light video. Now, I'll tell you this much, I didn't really stabilize my hands as well as I probably could have had I not been returning from the gym while I took the shot, but regardless, I do think that both have some stutters or jerks making it into the shot. Of course, it's low light, so that's gonna happen even more, but I think it happens way more on the OnePlus. Also, the exposure balance and the exposure in general isn't quite as good as with the X100 Pro. You can tell a lot of the times it just underexposes a lot, while the X100, I think in most cases it just maintains much better exposure and really good contrast as well. Also, the detail levels are higher on the X100 and I see slightly less noise on the X100 as well. Now, I tried to zoom out to the ultrawide camera, which I would not recommend using at night anyways, but the OnePlus did this, which is, complete blackout on the OnePlus, and the focusing is all over the place. So yeah, at first I just thought this is how the ultrawide looks, but I just couldn't believe it, so I had to take a sample again. And well, would you look at that, now the OnePlus fixed the exposure and the focusing problems altogether. So apparently, when we zoom out while we're taking nighttime video from the main camera to the ultrawide, that causes some kind of problem on the OnePlus 12, not so much on the X100. But to be honest, again, just use the main camera when you're doing low light because the ultrawide camera just doesn't even come close. And then finally we have slow motion. Of course, it's just 1080p 240 on both. 4K 120 is still not here on either of these, but I don't know why that's the case. Regardless, both of them look really nice. I kinda like the slightly higher contrast on the X100 Pro more, it's just a personal preference at this point. And so with that said, this is a wrap for our comparison. I gotta say, I kinda expected this to happen. See, the OnePlus 12, OnePlus devices, especially the flagship killer devices that they've been making, in general they have always had some or the other kind of issues with the video department. Now, again, Vivo had similar issues with the video department. They completely fixed it with the X100 Pro, but OnePlus still hasn't done that yet. I'm holding out hope that next year it might happen, but for now at least I can tell you this much. The X100 Pro, it definitely has better video. It has much more stable in terms of the exposure and contrast. It is much more stable with 4K. It just looks a little bit better in 4K 60, and most importantly, the 8K video I think it's the most viable 8K video that I've ever seen. Now, I'm not sure about the S24 Ultra, I haven't really compared the video with the X100 just yet, but so far the X100 is very impressive. The OnePlus is not bad, I do want to point that out and be very clear about it. The X100 is just really good, that's kind of the situation here. So anyways, I do hope you guys enjoyed, found this helpful, and I will see you guys soon with more. Cheers!